In the name of God, Creator, pain-bearer, and Spirit of life. As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down. Pretty shocking words, apparently from the mouth of Jesus. The temple in Jerusalem was more than a symbol. It was more even than a magnificent ancient building. It was the centre of the nation. It represented their existence as a people and formed the very identity of the Jewish nation. To say it will be totally destroyed would have been a statement beyond belief. Of course, when Luke wrote these words in the 8th decade of the 1st century, around 73 or thereabouts, that temple did lie in ruins, as the Roman army had destroyed it in the year 70. So Luke was using that historical event to make a rhetorical point in his gospel story. What then was his point? It all comes down to his focus on the persecution of what I will call the early church, that is, the followers of the way, as it was known, the way of Jesus of Nazareth. Opposition and persecution came from both the Roman government and the so-called, I'll call them Orthodox Jewish rabbis and their congregations in the synagogues. So the little group of, we'll call them Christians, they weren't known by that name of course then, were besieged on many fronts. And this is what Luke is addressing here in his gospel, basically. Professor Emerson Powery writes, Luke's primary distinction from the other Gospels, in the second half of the story, occurs in verse 15. I will give you a mouth and wisdom unable to be contradicted. As in Israel's tradition, wisdom has her children, and that's Luke chapter 7, go back into 7 and 35. An allusion both to the personification of the wisdom presence as told in some of the books of the Old Testament. And I've spoken about wisdom as a personification in the past, a feminine side of God, if you want to put it that way, very simply. And from those stories of wisdom and that personification of wisdom, right up to John the Baptist, that is, and Jesus. Jesus, who was, as a child, one who grew in wisdom and divine favour. Only within the Gospel of Luke is the wisdom of God a speaking agent. And so in this way, God's wisdom will allow the persecuted followers of Jesus to speak when the time comes. Jesus says that he will provide that wisdom during that time, a wisdom in the Lucan tradition that is even greater than Solomon's. Luke is trying to shore up and encourage his hearers in the face of strife and persecution, and is using the story of destruction to emphasize God's ultimate provision and support in times of trouble. Like everything else in life, people can be very selective. No less so than when it comes to reading and interpreting the biblical writings. For many years now, some churches have focused their interest on the apocalyptic themes that are found in the Bible, and therefore they've created congregations whose members tend to focus on these so-called end times. They find themselves waiting for these events to occur. They even begin to interpret current world events as signs that the end is nigh. They do this to the detriment of their wider involvement and participation in our society. They become self-obsessed. It's all about me and the events that they believe will happen to them. There's an old saying relevant here. Too heavenly minded to be any earthly good. I also remember an old revival hymn which had the words, "This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through." Now, I'm of the opinion that that sort of thinking is nothing less than an insult to God. I delight in this world and the mind-boggling universe of which we form such a minuscule part. I delight in its diversity and its beauty. I'm amazed and totally humbled by the images being beamed back to us by NASA's James Webb Space Telescope. After seeing these images and absorbing the absolute mind-boggling distances involved, I am at a loss to understand how some humans can even begin to imagine that they're important in the greater scheme of things. The beauty, the glory of this universe is only marred by the crass stupidity, greed and selfishness of much of humanity. I regularly give heartfelt thanks that I have been born and given the opportunity to witness such beauty and wonder. It seems to me that a sermon that disregards a bodily lived faith in this present life is not really preaching the gospel at all. Jesus' I've done it again. Thank you. Apocalyptic teaching, as interpreted here by Luke, must be viewed in light of the rest of his lived experience. It is that lived experience which makes up the heart of Luke's story, that makes Jesus one of wisdom's children. In the ancient world, apocalyptic language generally appealed to those on the margins of society, those whose lives were disrupted by the Roman Empire's imposed rule, language, and ideas. There were signs that suggested the empire might not last forever. You could understand that. People living under those sorts of pressures back then would feel, let's bring on the end of the world. Let's do it. Let's get rid of all this. You know, you could see the way of thinking, the possibilities of it. Quite frankly, I'm not particularly interested in what many call personal salvation. It's a way of thinking that turns a person's thoughts and attention back upon themselves, often to the exclusion of all others. That is certainly not how I interpret the life of Christ as glimpsed in the gospel stories. Stories of Jesus reveal a man who put others and their lives before his own. He could never be accused of being self-focused, and I truly believe that we who say we are his followers must, if we are honest with ourselves and are honest with God, live a similar kind of life, as much as we're able to do that at least. Here in the 21st century Australia, we live in a place and a time not of persecution, as some in other parts of the world who profess Christianity certainly do, but of sterile apathy. Just as Luke was encouraging his followers to rest in and rely on the Spirit of God in the face of their persecutions, so too do we need the ministrations of the Spirit as we struggle to hold on to and build our congregation in the face of rejection and apathy. Perhaps we can take Luke's advice. And he goes on to say in the Gospel, "For I will give you words to speak and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict." Now, it's not going to be an easy fix, he says, for it will take endurance. But friends, it's much more than mere words. Okay, words can be powerful, we all know that. Words can be hurtful, divisive, and damaging. But Luke is telling us that it is our actions, our way of living that counts. I pray that we'll be given the strength and the love to endure and not despair. May we always be made aware of the presence of the Spirit of God in our lives. The Lord be with you. Amen.